So in 3 weeks' time, it will be Easter. It really is that close. But there's a fair bit to get through between now and Easter Sunday in 3 weeks' time. There is a bit more on that journey, including the cross. As we mentioned last week, Mark's narrative journey has now brought us into Holy Week. And so we are now moving through some of the Holy Week stories. And different Gospels have different chronological order for what happens in Holy Week. And this is Mark's one, looks something like this. So on Sunday we have the triumphant entry. On Monday he overturns the tables in the temple. On Tuesday he's back in the temple teaching and having some verbal clashes with the religious leaders. Wednesday in Mark's Gospel is a rest day. If you read some of the other Gospels, that is the day that Jesus is anointed with the woman with the alabaster jar. Thursday's Passover, the Garden of Gethsemane and the arrest. Friday is the trial, crucifixion and death. And so that's sort of the chronological order. We're up to Tuesday. And so we're in the temple and we're having some time of teaching. And you can hear the urgency in Jesus' teaching at this point. But when you think about it, after 3 years of public teaching, this is Jesus' last day of doing that. He doesn't, again after this point, do any public teaching. He certainly teaches his disciples, but not public like he is doing at the moment. And as I showed last week, unfortunately this last time of public teaching for Jesus turns into a bit of a showdown with the religious leaders. On Wednesday night at our second Lenten Bible studies, we spent a bit of time exploring some of this showdown with the religious leaders. And there was a perspective that I came across late in my preparation for the Lenten study on Wednesday. And I just wondered whether I could share this idea here, because I think it gives a helpful framework for understanding what happens next in the Bible reading for today. It's a story about two rabbis, and it gives the context or the question of which side are you on? And so the story goes that around the time of Jesus, there was two well-known Jewish rabbis. Their names were Shammah and Hamel. And the story goes that they were always arguing with each other. They were always in conflict with each other, but that was just because they came from two different perspectives. Not that necessarily one was right and one was wrong, they just looked at things differently, which led to these conflicts. Shammah was a conservative Jew who believed that we need to strictly adhere to the law of God. In his words, if God has commanded us to do something, then that's what we should do. Full stop. If God says do it, we do it. He would explain that we show God respect and love by faithfully living out the laws, the commandments and the practices as listed in the Torah. Whereas Hillel had a very different approach. He would say that while the laws are critically important, they needed to be applied to the context of the situation that we will find ourselves in. And even went a step further to say, if God shows us grace and understanding, then we also need to show grace and understanding to the people around us. Is this sort of making sense, the two different approaches? Shammah would say we are bound to follow the letter of the law because it's God commands. Hillel would say we need to understand the spirit of the law and how best to reflect that as we love and care for those around us. There was an example that was given in the material that I was reading that I shared at the Bible study. It's not the greatest example, but it does highlight what this is about. So the question was, if a bride that was not beautiful on her wedding day asked you the question, "Am I beautiful?" how would you answer that? Shammah would argue that you would have to tell her the truth because you cannot lie. You cannot say that she's beautiful because you cannot lie. That's following the letter of the law. Whereas Hamel would say all brides are beautiful on their wedding day because that's just the way it is. Can you see the two different approaches? Both you would say, oh, I get where they're coming from, but it depends what your perspective is which one you might agree with or not. You know, do you read the letter of the law and apply it, or do you ponder and shape the law around the response to the situation that you find yourself in? There's some similarities to what we argue about today, isn't there? In the Christian church, in the broad Christian church, not just here, about this idea, do we follow the letter of the Bible exactly, or do we shape that around the situations that we find ourselves in? It's not that dissimilar to today. The tricky part about Shammah and Hillel is that neither of them are wrong. Neither of them could you say, they've got that wrong. It's just because they had different perspectives. Although if you take either of those perspectives to the extreme, then I think you are getting into wrong territory. However, you couldn't say that either of them are wrong. So during Jesus' time, there was this thing that people wanted to know, which side are you on? Are you more like Shammah and that approach to the law, or are you more like Hamel and that approach to the law? Jesus has already been caught up in this debate before now. We've had this Bible reading already from Mark chapter 3. Let me just reread it for you with these glasses on and see what you think. So Jesus went into the synagogue, and a man with a shriveled hand was there. Some of them were looking for a reason to accuse Jesus, so they watched him closely to see if he would heal him on the Sabbath. Do you get this? This is the debate in very simple terms. Because if you are on the side of Shammah would say that you have to follow the letter of the law. Therefore, do not do anything on the Sabbath. Therefore, you do nothing about this. You do not heal the man on the Sabbath. Whereas Hillel would say that the need to look after somebody who is hurting supersedes the law about doing nothing on the Sabbath. That's more important. So of course you would heal the person. So when Jesus walks into the temple in Mark chapter 3, they're all looking, going, which side is he on? Come on, out yourself. Which side are you on? Jesus turns it back on them. In verse 3, he says to the man with the shriveled hand, stand up in front of everybody. And then Jesus asks them, which is lawful on the Sabbath, to do good or do evil, to save life or to kill? He's just turned it straight back onto them and said, all right, you out yourself. Which side are you on? Are you team Shammah or are you team Hamel? You tell me first before I tell you. And what happened to them? They remained silent. They didn't want to say anything. They didn't want to say which side they were on. So what does Jesus do? Jesus does pick a side here and heals the man, and it says that the Pharisees then sided with the Herodians on how they might kill him. This is way back in Mark chapter 3, and they're already going, we've got to get rid of this person. We've got to get rid of this person. So now we fast forward 9 more chapters. Now we're in Mark chapter 12, the reading that we had today, and this debate is still going on. It's still going on. You know, when they asked him about taxes, you could read it in the idea of these two frameworks. When Jesus talks about the corrupt economic system, like we were talking about last week, there was an element of you could still view this in those two frameworks. But our reading today starts with verse 28, when one of the teachers of the law came up and asked, what is the greatest commandment? Which of all the commandments, which is the most important? And you could say this was a very genuine question, that maybe this teacher was actually going, you've answered some really good answers. I want to know this answer. I'm very genuine about this. Or you could say, he's just trying to get Jesus to pick a side again. Because if you are Team Shema, what would you say? You would choose a commandment that highlights how we have to follow the law. But if you're on a Team Hamel, you would choose a commandment that somehow reflected our need to, treat other people well or something like that. So how does Jesus answer this? He starts with a very, very well-known set of words in Judaism, the Shema. This is the prayer that every Jewish person would pray every morning. It comes from Deuteronomy chapter 6, and it's part of the same passage where the Ten Commandments are given. It is such a key line in the Torah, and a key line for all Jewish people. So it sort of makes sense that Jesus would quote this incredibly well-known prayer. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. There is a lot of meaning behind why Jesus chose that passage. And I don't have time to go into this morning. Grab the Bible study from last Wednesday, because we did go more into that from last Wednesday. We'll check out the website where there's some videos on that. But what I can say is that when Jesus quoted the Shema, all those on Team Shema, the team, yes, we have to follow the letter of the law here, would have started nodding their head, going, yep, he's got the right answer. That is what we wanted to hear. We wanted Jesus to say those words, that the most important thing of all is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, your soul, your mind, and your strength. They would have been nodding, going, he's now on our side. But Jesus didn't stop. He didn't even finish the sentence. In the same sentence, he then links that up with Leviticus 19:18, which says, and love your neighbour as yourself. And I could imagine there's some confusion at this point. Did Jesus just give 2 commandments when we asked him for one? Or did Jesus blend 2 commandments together into making one? Either way, yes, Jesus did that. He didn't answer the question like they want him to answer. He gave this answer of saying 2 ideas in one. And I think this was more than just Jesus being clever about, if I give 2 answers, then I've basically kept both sides happy here. Because Team Hallel would have liked the second part of that answer. And so in a sense, I just pleased everybody. I think it's more than that. I think that in his last public teaching session that Jesus had, he was trying to explain something incredibly profound, that loving God and loving our neighbour are intertwined. That you can't actually do one without the other. You can't have one of those commandments without the other, as John's brilliant kids talk this morning highlighted. Of course, the most important thing is to love God with all we have, but we can't love God if we're not reflecting that love to the people around us. And at the same time, of course, the most important thing is to show love to those around us, especially for those people in need. But that love in action doesn't make sense if it's not done in the context of our love for God. They're both needed. They're so intertwined, you can't separate one from the other. In the end, Jesus didn't come down either on Team Shema or on Team Hamel. He came down on the side of love. Love God and love others. In verse 32, there's this beautiful moment when the teacher of the law who asked the question pauses and reflects and agrees with Jesus. Put that in the context of Mark 12, where all the rest of Mark 12, they're in conflict with each other and arguing with each other. And in this moment, he goes, you're right. You're right. You can't do one without the other. It is about loving God and loving our neighbour. This teacher of the law said loving God and loving our neighbour are more important than any burnt offerings or sacrifices. He goes, you're right, it's all about love. And Jesus goes, you are so close to getting it. You are closer than anyone else I've spoken to about getting what this is about. And it would be a great point to end this sermon right there, because that is the point that Jesus was trying to make. But I think in the context of our Lenten journey, and it's being only 3 weeks out of Easter, we need to acknowledge that Jesus actually went further in his example and is challenging us to do more than just choose the side of love. It's about loving God with all our heart and all our soul and all our mind and all our strength, and to love our neighbour with all that we have, compassionately, genuinely, inclusively, completely. I think Jesus is wanting to push us a little bit further today and to say, if we're going to offer praise and worship to God, then do it passionately. Do it with all that you have. If we're going to serve others with our gifts, then do it extravagantly. Do it with all that we have. If we're helping others, do it generously. Do it with all that we have. I think Jesus is encouraging us to take some risks and embrace a radical approach to what it means to love God and love others. Love with all that we have. And Jesus goes on to give 2 examples of what this means: the teacher of the law and the poor widow. Outwardly, the teacher of the law was respected and honoured because they seemed to be doing and saying all the right things. They wore the right clothes. They said the right things. They prayed long prayers. Anybody who prays long prayer must be doing the right thing, mustn't they? They followed the letter of the law, and yet in our Bible reading they had the line, but they devour widows' homes. It's a weird phrase. It is a confronting phrase. In the context of what we learnt about earlier in Mark 12, when we talked about, well, maybe these people with power and influence were taking land off people who owned it and then using it to make more money for themselves. Devouring widows' homes. Oh, gee. I think what Jesus is trying to say here is you can't love God if you're doing stuff like that. If you're not showing love to the people around you, then your love for God is not making any sense. It's a bit like what God said in Amos chapter 5 when God said, I don't want your religious festivals. I don't want your choice offerings or the music from your hearts if they're not already aligned with righteousness and justice. And went on to say, let justice flow like a river. It doesn't make any sense if you're doing that other stuff. The worship you're giving to me is not making any sense. Instead, Jesus paused to a poor widow, maybe one of the widows who had their house devoured by the teachers of the law, who are putting 2 small copper coins in the offering. And even though it's insignificant compared to the large offering of other people, Jesus said, this is what it means to love God and love others. Because she gave everything. She gave all. I remember as a teenager being really challenged by this idea and trying to work out what this meant for me. I really, really wanted to love God and love others with all my heart and all my soul and all my mind and all my strength. But I was a bit discouraged as a teenager because I was looking around the church at some of these saints that I had in my church growing up, and compared to them, I was barely loving God with anything at all. I'm thinking, well, I want to love God with all, but I'm not. What am I doing wrong here? And I mentioned this to one of the saints, and she said to me this. She said, I think that all is different for different people. And she says, I think that the all changes at different times throughout your life. Do you understand what she was trying to say? That the all applies to us. What does it mean for us to give our all? not in compared to the saints up the back, but to us. And maybe there's different times in our life that life does demand more from us and the all that we can give is smaller. But then there might be other times that the all is bigger. We have to work out what it means for us in the situation that we find ourselves. What does it mean right now for you to love God with all your heart and all your soul and all your mind and all your strength, and to love the neighbour with all that you have? So as we head into these final weeks of Lent, we draw nearer to the cross. We begin to remember again, to see again how Jesus gave all for us on the cross. The cross is where Jesus showed the full extent of his love. So I say again, if we offer God praise and worship, then I encourage us to do it passionately with all that we have. If we serve God with our gifts, let's do it extravagantly with all that we have. If we're helping others, let's do it generously with all that we have. What does it mean for you to recommit this morning to love God and love others? What does it mean for you to do that with all that we are, all that we have?